you for joining us for today's webinar. Just a note, all attendees are in listen-only mode, and we will be opening the session up for questions after the presentation. With that, let's get started. Moua?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Moua, and I'm the Executive Director and President of the Asian American Justice Center. We're a member of the Asian American Center for Advancing Justice. We're very excited that you can join us as we discuss the results of our post-election survey and our new report, Behind the Numbers. Each of you should have received a link in Friday's press release. But in case you didn't, you can also access it from each organization's website. This report follows a number of pre-election surveys on Asian American and Pacific Islander voting attitudes and behaviors. Our group conducted one in the spring, followed by one in the fall. Because there's usually a dearth of survey data on AAPIs, we felt it was important to ensure that the AAPI role in the election was well documented. This was particularly the case as plenty of media attention was paid to the Asian American and Pacific Islander votes right after the election. News outlets across mediums were touting the overwhelming support by Asian Americans for President Obama, and speculation ran rampant about this support even from the Asian American ethnic communities that have voted more Republican in the past. So before I turn this over to our presenters, I want to provide some quick demographic information to help put what happened with the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities in 2012 in context and for future elections. As we know, the Asian American community is the nation's fastest growing racial group, and Pacific Islanders are the second fastest growing racial group over the last decade, with more than 17.6 million Asian Americans and 1.2 million Pacific Islanders made up from many, many different ethnic groups. Much of the Asian American community's population boom is fueled by the growth in South Asian communities. Among Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians and Samoans are the two largest subgroups. The community's population growth is mirrored in its increasing political importance. So historically, Asian Americans voted at rates below the national average for two main reasons: lower rates of citizenship and lower rates of voter registration. Nevertheless, Asian Americans' share of the electorate is growing. It went from 1.6% in 1996 to nearly 2.5% in 2008. And in 2008, approximately 600,000 Asian Americans voted for the first time. We anticipate that the final breakdowns of the 2012 election will show a similar gain, and estimate that the Asian Americans will have cast at least 2.8% of the 2012 votes. As Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders' share of the electorate grow, and it becomes even more important to engage them through voter mobilization efforts. I'll now turn to our presenters to provide some of the detailed information about how Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders voted in November, what barriers to voting they encountered, and the level of mobilization conducted by the parties and community-based organizations to Asian American and Pacific Islander voters, all of which we hope will help campaigns and get out the vote efforts reach our communities in future elections. After we hear from each of our presenters, we will open the discussion up for Q&A. So first up, we will hear from Karthick Ramakrishnan, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of California, Riverside. Karthick also directs the National Asian American Survey. He will be discussing the 2012 Asian American and Pacific Islander vote. Karthick?
Great. Thank you, Mia, and thank you, everyone, for attending. Next slide, please. So as Mia noted, there have been a lot of surveys being done on the Asian American and Pacific Islander population. 2012 was a very robust and fortunate year. In addition to the two pre-election surveys, one in the fall and one in May conducted by Lake Research, one in the fall conducted by National Asian American Survey. There have been other surveys done as well, and we can talk a little bit in the Q&A about how some of the findings may be a little bit different because there is some variation in methodology. For us, this is the 2012 AAPI PES, which is a post-election survey. It's the largest nationally representative survey, and that's important to note because you have other surveys, some other surveys that have been done that are exit polls that are drawn from particular polling locations and are therefore not as fully representative of the national sample. This is also the only survey that was conducted in 9 Asian languages, in addition to English and Spanish. And we are particularly proud that we have coverage of Pacific Islanders, a community that often is overlooked in survey research, Cambodians and Hmong, and for the first time ever, the inclusion of Laotian Americans in a nationally representative survey of public opinion. This has never been done before, and we're particularly happy that this is the case now. Next slide. So we conducted over 6,500 interviews, and this was done in November and December of 2012. Consequently, the margin of error is relatively small when it comes to the overall Asian American population, plus or minus 1.5%. For Pacific Islanders is plus or minus 5%. And then for the various national origin groups, it ranges from 3% for Chinese, Indians, and Vietnamese to 4 to 6% for all other groups. So when you look at the various findings either today or in the report that you have downloaded, do keep in mind these margins of error. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of voter turnout, we are awaiting the current population survey voter supplement report. That's likely to come about either in July or August of this year. In anticipation of that, we asked about self-reported voter turnout. One thing I should note about the current population survey is that even though many of us look to that as a standard for how to gauge voter turnout across racial groups, the CPS is only conducted in English and Spanish. And as Terry will talk about later on, language of interview ends up being very important for the Asian American community. So that is something that hopefully we can think about moving forward, is not only doing our own surveys, but finding ways to improve the data collections conducted by others. When it comes to voter turnout, the overall rate is in line with what we have found for previous years. Note that we are talking about voting among registered voters. That is what we mean by voter turnout, because the people we interviewed were registered voters. We used a registered voter file. Within the community, we see tremendous variation with relatively high rates of turnout among Hmong, Japanese, and Indian Americans who are registered voters, and low turnout among Cambodians and especially among Laotian Americans. Next slide, please. Looking at other categories within the AAPI group, we see that turnout among Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders is about the same as for the Asian American average. And we find some significant differences by gender and also by battleground state status, with turnout modestly higher among those living in battleground states versus those living outside of battleground states. Next slide, please. When it came to issues, we found that economy, jobs, the budget deficit, and Social Security were the top priorities. More so than, and this was similar for the national average outside of Asian Americans, but we found that education and healthcare also factored in heavily for Asian American voters, as did immigration, the environment, and racial discrimination. For Pacific Islanders, the findings were similar, except for importance according to the environment and national security were a little bit lower, and immigration was also lower, and this makes sense because the Pacific Islander population is far less likely to be foreign-born than the Asian American population. Next slide, please. Here we show you a composite table. This is there in the report. On the left-hand side, you'll see the ranking of issues in order of importance. And on the right-hand side, we've shown you this calculated gap between support for Obama and support for Romney. And we find that on issues like racial discrimination, education, and healthcare, you see very big gaps in voter support. And it gives you a preview of where Asian Americans ultimately voted when it came to the presidential race. Next slide, please. So how did Asian Americans vote? Next slide. Now to just take you back to our fall pre-election survey, we found that even 1 or 2 months before Election Day, the most striking finding was the high proportion of undecided voters in the Asian American community. And this varied across groups. Among those who decided, we found that there was more support generally for Obama than for Romney, but overall it was this high level of indecision. Next slide, please. However, if you removed all of the undecided voters and looked at what we call the two-way split between these two groups, I just want to focus on the finding all the way at the right. Our pre-election estimate was that about 70% would vote, our prediction was that 70% would vote for Obama and 30% would vote for Romney. Next slide, please. And as we find out in our post-election survey, which is in line with, and it's within the margin of error of other surveys, it's very close to what our pre-election estimate was. So I feel really good about the survey capacity within the Asian American community, especially with our National Asian American Survey methodology, that we were so close in our prediction to what the ultimate result turned out to be. Now what you'll find here is that with 68% for Obama, 31% for Romney, and 1% for other, that finding is different. It's lower for Obama than what the national election poll, exit poll data showed, which had it at 73%, as well as the election eve poll that Capacity and ALDEF did, which showed it at 72%. We believe that a lot of this difference is related to language of interviews that were supported. We also feel confident in this estimate because of the way that the sample was generated. As we said, it's nationally representative and it covers more groups than any other survey. Across groups we find significant differences, but one of the things that's remarkable here is that President Obama won every single Asian American nationality group. And this is significant to note because in our pre-election survey there was some uncertainty in terms of how Filipinos would be voting. There was a high level of uncertainty in the Filipino vote and also in the Vietnamese American vote. This is also important because the Vietnamese population, which traditionally has voted very Republican, has been trending more and more Democrat over the past few years, and we find that in 2012, Obama definitively won the Vietnamese American vote. I should note that this finding is also a little bit different from what you might have seen in some other surveys, but again, this is a nationally representative sample and we feel confident in this estimate. Next slide, please. In terms of the Pacific Islander vote, we find that Native Hawaiians supported President Obama in about the same ratio as the Asian American population. Vote support among Samoans was lower, although this is within the margin of error given the higher margins of error that we find for the Samoan population. In terms of the gender gap, it's important to note that there is no gender gap in the Asian American vote, and this is very different from what you find for the national average, especially among white voters. That's where you find the biggest gender gap in terms of presidential voting. In the case of Asian Americans, as it is for other groups, it seems that race ends up trumping gender when it comes to presidential voting. And then finally, it didn't make a difference if you lived in a battleground state or a non-battleground state. Levels of support for Obama versus Romney were virtually the same. Next slide, please. So how important was the AAPI vote? One way to think about this is nationally in terms of the popular vote. Another way is to think of the Electoral College. When we look at the popular vote, we find that the addition of the Asian American vote share and their net votes for President Obama increased his popular vote margin from 3.5 million to 5 million. So AAPI has added about 1.5 million votes to the overall popular vote margin for President Obama. So whatever mandate that the president got from his popular vote victory, Asian Americans were a significant part of that story. Next. Looking within states, we find that for the presidential election, the states where the Asian American vote had the greatest impact were in Florida and Virginia. Florida is something that was not anticipated, but given how close the vote was, it turned out that the Asian American vote share was larger than the margin of victory in that election for the presidential election in Florida. The Asian American vote share was also close in states like Nevada and Ohio and North Carolina, but they were nevertheless slightly smaller than the presidential margin of victory. Next slide, please. So even though we know that polls like the Edison, this is the National Election Poll data that is widely cited by organizations like USA Today, New York Times, and CNN who pay into the service, it is limited in that there isn't Asian language support. Still, we find that even among those who are English dominant, there's been a tremendous shift towards the Democratic vote for president. At the same time, we still contend with the fact that this clear shift in presidential vote patterns is still, we need to reconcile that with the fact that AAPIs, you still have a very large proportion of them who do not identify in terms of any political party or don't think in terms of political parties. This is why we say that the AAPI vote still seems like it's up for grabs, because even though they're voting in a particular pattern and issues seem to matter to them, there still is a lot of room for persuasion. Next slide. So back to you, Mi.
Thank you, Karthick. Next, we have Christine Chen. She is the founding and current executive director of Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote, or APIA Vote. Christine also served as national coordinator of the APIA Vote Presidential Town Hall. Christine will discuss mobilization efforts by parties and grassroots organizations during the 2012 elections. Christine?
Great, thank you, Mi. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. As you see here, first of all, we want to ask the question, were Asian Americans voters contacted? We know that with multiple touches that voters will have the more likelihood to actually come out and vote. But yet, what's still disturbing is that 67% of our community of Asian American voters were not contacted. In the next slide, you'll see that 71% of Pacific Islanders were also not contacted at all. What that means is that the parties can only strengthen their support, especially on the Democratic side, if they actually invest more resources and time and energy, if they reach out to Asian American and Pacific Islander voters. Or on the Republican side, they actually do have a chance to build up their base and potentially take away votes. Because as noted by Karthick earlier, our community, a base of voters, do not necessarily identify as much with the actual political parties, but it's really about the multiple touches and the relationships that they have with the candidates. With the next slide, we actually are talking about specific breakdowns in terms of what ethnic communities were actually reached out to. As you see, the Hmong community has a high rate of 49%. We also see that there has been a history with the Hmong community, especially in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and California, where they're concentrated, that they have a longer history of being contacted by the local parties and local candidates. Specifically, like in Minnesota, Moua, who's now the executive director for AAJC, was the first senator, state senator that was voted in as among American women in Minnesota. With the galvanization of voters there, they really were able to build up a base and prove to the political parties that they need to reach out to Hmong voters on a regular basis. At the same time, we see lower reaching out of the Samoan, Hawaiian, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander on average is a lot lower. A lot of that we also view that is because the lack of good data in regards to the voter files and designating Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander voters. With the next slide, what we see is that once again, in battleground states, there's a lot more contact by Democrats and Republicans versus non-battleground states. But one other thing we would like to point out is the role of community organizations. Although you see it at 24 or 25%, we also need to recognize that typically the resources and funding provided to the nonprofit community and community organizations is a lot lower than what is provided to Democrats and Republicans when reaching out to voters. So we want to go ahead and turn to talking a little bit about some of the partisan efforts and the nonpartisan efforts that was made for mobilization on the ground. For the Republicans, what we saw this round was that Elaine Chao recorded a robocall for Virginia Chinese voters. In Ohio, a Republican PAC sent out Chinese translated materials to Chinese voters as well. In Virginia, on the Democratic side, we saw the hiring of Vietnamese, Chinese, and Korean field organizers. And both parties did go ahead and place translated materials and ads utilizing the ethnic press. But with the Democratic side, since they actually have a larger base of Asian American Pacific Islander elected officials, they were able to utilize a lot more surrogates in their work in different places like Nevada, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Moving on to the nonpartisan efforts, we have to say that this year in 2012 was probably the largest mobilization effort of the Asian American Pacific Islander community, especially with the nonpartisan nonprofit community working in 15 different states across the country. In the next slide, you'll see that the work that the nonprofit community did started with the pre-election work where there were regional trainings where we made sure that they had access to tools and voter files and really tried to develop local strategies to incorporate into their campaigns and to actually develop field plans. On election day, they went ahead and did work in regards to rise to the polls, poll monitoring. There was a multilingual Asian hotline that AAJC and APIA Vote had incorporated, and many of them incorporated into their field plans language assistance. And as we move on to 2013, we are looking now at engaging into the 2013 local elections as well as in the primaries. So what I would like to do is just go ahead and touch upon some of the case studies that we did note that happened all across the country. In New York, we noted that our counterparts, Ming Kwan and the coalition there, reached out to about over 25,000 voters. But at the same time, they were also hindered because of the Hurricane Sandy, as with most voters in the New York, New Jersey area. In Ohio, they also had built a coalition to reach out to Asian American voters in Cincinnati, Columbus, Dayton, Oberlin, and Cleveland. In Minnesota, there was also another coalition and collaborative that was created to reach out to 13,000 Asian Americans, where they recruited 800 volunteers and interpreted and gave over 600 rides. They also utilized 24 radio PSAs and ads, just because, especially with the Hmong community, the radio was a really effective way to reach out to the community in itself. And also another coalition that was built was in Oregon with the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon. They reached over 10,000 APIs through ballot parties, where voting in Oregon is essentially done through the mail. They also created and distributed voter guides in 6 different languages. With that, what they did was they reached out to the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, asked for the candidates to fill out a survey, and then 5 profiles were actually incorporated into the voter guide. The only 5 profiles that actually were incorporated were the ones that participated, and unfortunately, none of the Republican candidates participated. And as a result, what we also saw was that all those that did not respond, those that failed to respond also were not elected. The issue of hoekstra during the Super Bowl, where stereotypical imagery and languages were utilized in disparaging ways, characterizing the Asian American community. At the same time, they also worked with the Bangladeshi community in terms of trying to ensure that Section 203 was complied in as they start to use, as Bangla was actually translated this round. So as we move on to the next slide, we want to talk about the untapped potential for the mobilization. As we move forward in the 2013 local elections, we want to recognize that if you look at the margin of difference in the presidential race, for instance, in Virginia, it's 115,000, where the AAPI population, voting age population, is over 227,000, or in Nevada, 66,000 was the margin of difference, yet our voting age population of our community is double of that. You know, we can only make further a larger difference in the local elections. Or as we continue to advocate on policies such as immigration, we need to demonstrate and to continue to talk to our elected officials and to the political parties about the difference that the Asian American Pacific Islanders voters continue to make in this past election and will continue to do so as we move forward. At this time, we'll go ahead and move on to Terry Au.
Great. Thank you, Christine. Finally, on our final presenter is Terry Au Minnis. She's the Director of Census and Voting Programs at the Asian American Justice Center. She's also a member of the AAJC team for over a decade. And as a member of our voting team, she has worked on the Voting Rights Act reauthorization, election protection campaigns, and voter surveys. Terry will be discussing with all of us language barriers for AAPIs in general, but in particular the language barriers for the AAPI electorate in 2012. Terry?
Thank you, Mi. As everyone has mentioned so far, language plays a key role, and we all know this, of course. Just a quick number of facts to throw out there. Nationally, we know that 60% of the Asian American population is foreign-born, and we see 3 out of 4 speaking a language other than English at home. Now, of course, these figures are even higher when we look at adults, including adult citizens. For example, we see that 44%, or almost half, of Asian American adults have difficulty speaking English. For our post-election survey, we saw that these rates were even higher for our respondents. 84% said they spoke a language other than English at home. More than a majority, 55%, said they had difficulty speaking English. And interesting to note, and really kind of underscoring or highlighting Karthick's point, we saw that 54% of our respondents were actually surveyed in English, but 46%, almost half, actually decided to take the survey in an Asian language. So as we know, difficulties in English can result in problems with understanding complex voting materials, as well as the complicated process and procedures that we have in place. And this may lead to a voter, an LEP voter, feeling intimidated, especially if they encounter misunderstandings or even hostility at the polls from poll workers or other voters. We see here in this slide that there was clearly an impact of language on the voter turnout, right? LEP voters turned out 9% less than the English-speaking voters. And so we see that language barrier playing a role in whether or not our community members are actually going out to vote. And even when we saw, looked at why people decided not to vote in the past election, we saw that these rates were similar both for those who said that they were limited English proficient or had difficulties with English, as well as those who thought that they spoke English very well. And I think this really highlights the big role that language barriers play when we're talking about the election process, which has many different layers, many different roles, and can be very unclear to people who are trying to go exercise their right to vote. Language barrier may also be one of the reasons why we saw almost a third of Asian Americans decide to vote by mail. LAP voters may want to vote by mail because they have access to friends and relatives who can help and provide translations at home, and they may be more accessible that way. You can work with their schedules, and it also allows the LAP voter to take their time in completing the ballot without having to worry that they're holding up the line, having people kind of look at them, rumble at them, and try to, kind of intimidate them at the polls. And so this really provides an option for LAP voters to feel comfortable with the process and be engaged. Interestingly, we also saw that the non-LAP voters also voted by mail at similar rates. And I think this really highlights the general appeal of vote by mail, the convenience factor, as well as really giving people time, the ability to work the voting process into their busy schedule. So I think it is certainly one thing that we should be looking at moving forward as a means to and a way to engage our Asian American communities. So we all know that Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act actually requires jurisdictions that are covered to provide language assistance to voters during the voting process. Interestingly, our survey indicates that there's still a large gap in the actual provision of language assistance. As you see here, among those living in covered jurisdictions, only 55% who voted in person actually received either translated election documents or bilingual election workers at the polls to assist them with the voting process. While this proportion was higher among those who voted by mail, at 69%, it's still well short of the language assistance required by law. Pivoting now to the point that Karthick had made about the importance of making sure that the survey interviews are done in language and how critical it could be, is we can see that there is a distinct difference between the respondents who took the survey in English versus those who took it in Asian language with respect to their presidential vote choice. Those surveyed in English were more likely to vote for President Obama and have numbers that mirrors the National Election Poll Survey, which was done only in English and Spanish and no Asian languages. You'll notice the Asian language respondents voted less for President Obama, although still voting in a majority for him. We also saw language of interview was very important with respect to party identification. We saw the English respondents identify mostly as Democrats or as Democratic with 44%, and then as independents and then Republicans. But what was really interesting to see was that while the respondents who took the survey in an Asian language had significantly lower numbers of identifying with the Democratic Party, that difference did not translate into an identification with either being an independent or a Republican, or particularly as Republican, but more so indicates the fact that those who took the survey in Asian language were more likely not to think in terms of the two political parties. As you'll notice, 32 or almost a third of the Asian language respondents stated that they didn't know or didn't think in these terms when asked about party identification. And I think this really highlights not just the overall up for grabs, like Karthick had mentioned, for the Asian American and Pacific Islander community generally, but also the idea that for those who speak, who are more likely to have language barriers and more likely to need assistance in language, that they are more likely not to think in terms of the political party, and thus outreach and ways to motivate this population will certainly differ between them and those who took the survey in English. Finally, to sum up, just wanted to highlight a couple of facts that we already know, that the Asian American community is diverse and growing, but also that we see a clear trend in voting since 1992. and that in this past election we saw nearly we saw more than 2/3 of Asian American and Pacific Islanders voting for President Obama, and President Obama winning every segment of both the Asian American and Pacific Islander populations. So we still see that our communities are open to persuasion. Nearly half of Asian American and Pacific Islander registered voters identified as independent or undecided with respect to their party identification, and so clearly leaving open the possibility that they are open to persuasion and outreach by candidates, and with a clear focus on issues and priorities for our community. Finally, even though we've seen improvements in voter mobilization efforts from 2008, there's still more outreach that needs to be done, both by parties, campaigns, and other third-party voter mobilization organizations. And a key highlight, too, is I think that we need to continue to see funding, particularly for Asian American and Pacific Islander nonpartisan mobilization efforts, to be successful. As Christine had noted, many of our populations are not in battleground states and thus risk not having the attention paid to them that other communities may have in battleground states. And so for our organizations, we really do fill a gap that exists to really engage our community. Finally, cannot emphasize this enough, in-language outreach and survey efforts are critical to making sure that we both understand how to engage our community and to make sure that we are actually engaging our community. Thank you. Back to you, Mee.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to thank all our three presenters for doing such a great job. Before opening the discussion up for questions, I did want to mention that our affiliate, the Asian Pacific American Legal Center in Los Angeles, will be issuing a California-specific post-election survey report this summer. And with that, I'll turn it over to questions. So just a reminder, in order to ask questions, please use the raise your hand feature in the toolbar, or also submit your questions by the chat box feature that's on our webinar tool.
So while we wait, we did have a question about whether or not the presentation slides will be available to the attendees, and they will, along with the report and a recording of this webinar. Those will all be available on our respective websites. So once again, if you have questions, please feel free to either use the raise your hand icon to indicate that you have a question that you'd like to ask, and we can unmute your line. And then also the questions box is another place where you can enter in a question. First question we have is from Naomi. Naomi, please ask your question. Oh, perhaps your question was answered. While we're talking, Karthick, if you could, while we're waiting for people to ask their questions, Karthick, perhaps you can talk a little bit more about the survey results and between the various different surveys, and talk about how people can look at these numbers.
Happy to. Yeah. So as I was saying before, there's a lot. One thing we, one sign of maturity in the API community is that we have more surveys now, and I think one luxury we have now is to not get as wedded to one particular number. In some ways, Nate Silver taught us this when it came to the general population, and to some extent, we don't have as many surveys of APIs as we do for Latinos or for the general population. So, but we still can average them out, and so when you average out these national surveys, which is the National Election Pool Survey, what we have, and the Election Eve Survey, they all point to something in the high 60s, low 70s. So the average is 71%. So it's all within the range. Now that said, what we find that is very important is the differences by language of interview. And that's a limitation not only of the National Election Pool data, but also of the Gallup results that were presented about a few weeks ago. What Gallup did was actually even worse than what the National Election Pool data did, which is they looked at findings from the entire year, from January to December of 2012, and it was only English language interviews that were done of the Asian American population, and they reported out the party identification numbers. Now, as we know, those figures fluctuate during the course of a campaign in terms of how people identify, whether they lean towards a party or how strongly they feel towards one party or another. But you have that limitation. Layer on top of that the limitation that it's conducted only in English, and it's a partial picture of the Asian American and Pacific Islander population. So we really hope moving forward that, it's great to get the kind of attention that we do with the surveys that we do because we provide something that is unique. But we think it is really important for the national media organizations and also government data collection efforts. We talked about how the current population survey, which is an important indicator of the labor market, it's conducted both by the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and those surveys are only done in English and Spanish, and that leaves out a significant chunk of the Asian American community, and we hope there can be some progress made on that score as well.
Thanks, Karthick. And really quickly, if you could answer the question about what the sample size for the overall survey was.
So this is in our report. Sample size for the overall survey was just over 6,600 respondents. One thing I should also note that I forgot to mention is one important difference you will see in our survey and what was reported out from the ALDEF exit poll survey was for the Vietnamese population. ALDEF estimated that Romney won the Vietnamese American vote, but by their own telling, that survey isn't national. What we find from our national survey is that Obama won the Vietnamese American vote, and it wasn't even close. He won it, and it's outside of the margin of error.
Great, thank you, Karthick. Two quick just announcements, I guess logistic announcements, and then we'll go back to the questions. The report was released on Friday and is available on our website right now. So we will be happy to send that out to folks after the webinar. And sorry, I thought there was one more logistic question. And then, oh yes, and we'll be happy also to send out a notification when the slides are up as well. Moving on to another question, we have a question of whether or not we have information on how AAPIs react to the option to vote early. Anyone want to take that?
I need to go back and see. I believe we only, because of length limitations, I believe we only asked whether they voted in person or by mail. We did not ask a follow-up question whether people voted, if they said in person, if they voted on election day or before election day. But that is something that's that we hope in the future to be able to include. We had it, but ultimately we had to cut down because of survey length.
Great. Another question was what is the main base of numbers representative of populations and not registered voters for the race groups?
I guess I'm a little confused by that question. Could you rephrase that?
Momi, did you want to maybe ask your question? We'll unmute you in 1 second. Go ahead, Momi. Sorry, Momi, we're not actually getting your audio feed. Not sure if you wanted to perhaps
maybe just type out the question again, or
it says, was the main base of numbers representative of population and not registered voters for the race groups?
for the race groups, we weighted it by, we weighted it by population. I mean, the thing is we weighted it by the population, proportion of population, but we also weighted it by nativity and by population size, by gender, and by education. Part of the challenge by weighting it by proportion of voters is that the current population survey does not have Asian language support, so it's in some ways difficult to justify weighting to that. But in the past, when I've done weighting to one versus another, I mean, it will change some of these findings a little bit, but there are trade-offs involved. You might gain in terms of self-reported vote statements in the current population survey, but you're missing out on the language support that the American Community Survey has.
Great, thanks. I did want to mention from Momi, since we couldn't get the audio to work, and not entirely sure whether this was sent out to everybody, but Momi did have a comment that I thought was very interesting about how Hawaii is 6 hours behind the East Coast as news returns are broadcast from local news stations. This often ends up discouraging voters who would participate if their candidate is already ahead in the polls. Thus, voter turnout in Hawaii has been historically low, even for President Obama, whom Hawaii has great affection and support. I don't know, Christine, if you have any thoughts on what can be done to help encourage voting when you have this sort of logistic problem of kind of knowing how a race has turned out before you even get a chance to vote.
Right. So for those states that have early voting or can make it easier to do early voting or absentee voting, we're encouraging our community partners to actually educate our voters to actually take those options. Many times, political parties and candidates actually can gain access to the number of their supporters that are voting early. So they also keep that into account in terms of whether or not they'll actually will win a state or not. So that can actually play into it. The other thing is that we need to really get away from focusing on just national elections, even though I know there's a lot more resources poured into a presidential year. But what we also need to remember is that local elections really need to be a driving force to get our voters out to actually come out, whether it's a presidential year or every other year when we do have these local elections. I was also looking at Momi's question, maybe Karthick, I think what she was trying to ask was the main number of, for those that were surveyed, were they representative of the population or representative of those that were registered for that particular race? I think that's what her question was.
Right. So I thought I answered that. I mean, it's anyway. We can have this is a kind of more detailed kind of almost like a data geek question in terms of what sources of error are in terms of the population reference file that you use. But maybe I'm overthinking this question. One thing I did want to say. In terms of voter turnout, what'll be interesting to see when the current population survey data come out, and again, given the caveats in terms of the languages that are supported, what we found in our self-reported voting data in our survey was that there was actually lower than normal voting, self-reported voting in New York and New Jersey. And we think of that as the Hurricane Sandy effect. Now, we'll see how that turns out in the CPS data, and especially what it shows for other racial and ethnic groups. But it almost stands to reason that when you have natural disasters, lower propensity voting populations like the Asian American community might be more affected than other groups. So that's something that I'm certainly interested in and want to watch out for later this summer.
Great, thanks. There's a question about whether or not we have percentage of voter registration data among all Asian groups. I believe, well, I'm not entirely sure what the question is asking, whether it's for the collective Asian American population, which we do have numbers for both the 2008 and 2010 elections, and as Karthick mentioned, the current population survey data should be coming out later, maybe around summertime for the 2012 election. But if the question is around percentage of voter registration data per ethnic group, then I believe that we don't have that data. And Karthick, please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, so our sampling base is the registered voter population, so we wouldn't know the percent who are registered, but we do have that information from the past, and I believe that in the Advancing Justice report from 2011, they did have recent voter registration rates across groups. I mean, one thing I should say is that when we look across racial groups, we know that voter registration is one of the biggest barriers. So there are two major reasons why Asian Americans account for a smaller share of the electorate than they do of the resident population. One is lower rates of citizenship, and that's because they are the most heavily foreign-born group. And the other reason is because of much lower rates of registration, even among adult citizens. So these are two major factors, and that's something that will be important moving forward, looking at 2014 and 2016, is to increase voter registration among adult citizens. In California, we have a relatively new system of online voter registration, and it'll be interesting to see what the uptake is among Asian Americans. We may indeed see one problem solved where it's easier now to start registering people to vote, but it could be that the people that we started registering through online methods, maybe there may be more challenges trying to get them to vote, but it remains to be seen. It's kind of exciting and interesting and challenging all at the same time, thinking ahead to what it might mean.
This is also Christine. APIA Vote has information, at least by state, how many, what's the percentage of Asian Americans that are registered by state. There's not a breakdown by ethnicity group, though. This information is actually have been gathered and are estimates through the current population survey. So if you need that information, you could go ahead and reach out to me. I'll work with you about your particular state.
Great, and I think we have time for one more question. And the question is from Victoria: are AAPI voters more likely to turn out when an AAPI candidate is on the ballot locally?
So I'll take a crack at this. We've found some very modest evidence for that when we look nationally. But part of that problem might be that we just don't have as many local AAPI officials the way we do among Latinos to provide some of the kind of broader impacts in say a metropolitan area than you might for Latinos. But that's something worth monitoring looking ahead. What we do find is in the past when we've asked whether people would be more likely to vote for an Asian American candidate when they had the choice of two candidates and all else being equal, and there's a significant share of Asian Americans that say that they would. So having a co-ethnic or a co-racial candidacy is an appealing proposition for AAPI voters. So to the extent that we can increase the number of people interested in running for elected office, we can expect to see more support. We've seen this not only in terms of voting. There are other studies which show that AAPIs that run for national office, like Congress, are likely to draw political contributions from AAPIs from around the country. So that is something that will continue to be important as we move forward.
Thanks, Karthick. Did any of the other panelists want to answer that question before we close out the session?
Well, this is Moua. I know that
I was just thinking.
Go ahead, Me, and then Christine, you can say after what you have to say after.
Well, I just want to add that I know I'm not a panelist, I'm the moderator, but since Terry is doing such a good job helping us queue up the questions, I wanted to interject a little bit on this question. You know, as a former elected and a candidate for a long time in Minnesota, I just can't emphasize enough what Karthick has said. Having Asian Americans being candidates matters a lot. In fact, having people of color being candidates matter a lot. And whether that candidate ultimately is successful or not, to have a candidate on any side of the aisle be from the Asian American community or from the community of color makes a big difference, because once you are part of the system, it does force the political parties and it forces your opponents to look at the way that you do your campaigning a little bit differently. Now, this assumes that if you're an ethnic candidate that you would you know, be more intentional, and I think that it's true. When I was a candidate, I made sure that I was attentive to not only putting campaign materials, doing my outreach to the Hmong American community, which is one of the largest ethnic groups in the area that I represented, but I made sure that campaign materials that I put out was also in Spanish and in some other African languages, because I understood from my own experience how important in-language outreach was. And by doing that, I think in some ways I shamed, you know, other candidates and the political parties into thinking about, oh, what is she doing differently that we're not doing? And because I did that and because I was successful, I think it was a real demonstration of how important it was for mainstream candidates and political parties to look at, you know, in language but creative ways to do outreach into the community. So I think that it does matter when there are candidates of color on the ballot, whether they end up succeeding or not. The way that they campaign makes a big difference in both challenging as well as also in educating political parties and other candidates about how to do outreach into the different ethnic communities.
Great, thanks, Me. We have run out of time. So I did want to thank everybody for joining us on this webinar. I just wanted to close by saying we are really excited to be able to provide this data to kind of add to the other great work that's been done in this field, such as the election need poll conducted by AllDef and Capacity. You know, we really believe that our ability to provide this type of data collectively really helps to elevate our community and really make other entities, whether it be media, the parties, other mobilization organizations, really take notice of our community and, you know, urge them and hold them accountable to addressing our concerns and needs. And so we really want to say that, you know, we enjoy doing all this work collectively with you all and look forward to moving forward and being able to continue to do this great work.
Well, and also,
thank you.
Terry, just one second. Yeah, I wanted to reiterate that point too. I mean, it's what's great about having these different surveys too. I mean, one thing we've been focusing on is just what the vote looked like, but with these different surveys, there have been different questions that have been asked and also in different ways. And so that's been really helpful because all of us find that we have many more questions that we want to ask than that we're able to ask. We also ask questions in slightly different ways. And to have these different data points on things like immigration policy, for example, there are different surveys, all of whom show significant support of the AAPI population for a path to citizenship and for comprehensive immigration reform. That is so timely right now, and to have different data points from different surveys that have been conducted of the AAPI population to be used so that we're not used as a wedge in this issue, and to show that we're an important base of support for comprehensive reform is important.
Great. Thank you, Karthick. And please feel free to reach out to any of us if you still have burning questions that you'd like to have answered. We'd love to talk to you. Thank you. Have a great day.